Good afternoon. My name is Myrtis Fossey, and I am Deputy Leader of the Canadian Party of Quebec. According to our national anthem, Canada is the true, no, strong, and free. But in Quebec, I am not free to decide on the language of education for my child. In Quebec, I am not free to wear a symbol of my faith and teach in a public school. In Quebec, I am not free to withhold confidential information about a medical patient file when being inspected by an agent of the Office de la langue française. In Quebec, I am not free to communicate in the workplace in English. In Quebec, I am not free to wear a symbol of my faith and hold a public position of authority. In Quebec, I am not free to receive a judgment in English. In Quebec, I am not free to obtain government-issued certificates such as marriage, birth, or death in English. In Quebec, I am not free to receive emergency communications in English. In Quebec, I am not free to identify myself or my linguistic preference. I have to prove my identity with government-issued documentation. In Quebec, I am not free to receive health services or mental health services in English. In Quebec, as a foreign student, I am not free to choose my course load according to competency requirements in my field. I must learn French, regardless of my field of study, or else risk not graduating. In Quebec, I am not free to enjoy the protection of minority rights according to the Constitution. Some provinces are freer than others, it seems. 1 year ago, I was in this very place appealing to the federal government to prevent the passing of Quebec Language Law Bill 96 by invoking disallowance. Sadly, our appeal was ignored, but my resolve to defend the rights of Canadians remains strong. In January, I came back here once more to call for better leadership on the part of the federal government with respect to the constitutional rights of Canadians in Quebec. Crickets. Today, again, I am here to appeal to our federal government on behalf of Canadians in Quebec, but also Canadians in the rest of Canada. Today's appeal is to stop the renewal of the notwithstanding clause for Bill 21. We argue that disallowance for renewal is the most efficient course of action to stop Bill 21. Why should Bill 21 be stopped? Why should the average Canadian outside Quebec care about Bill 21? Bill 21 claims to be about secularism when in fact it facilitates systemic discrimination on the basis of religion by banning symbols of religious faith from being worn by public servants in positions of authority. The average Canadian should ask themselves, how is it possible that in a country that prides itself on diversity and religious freedom, one of its provinces, the province of Quebec, can pass a law that is fundamentally unconstitutional and un-Canadian? The reputation of Canada and Canadians is at stake. Bill 21 is an assault on international human rights and Canadian constitutional rights to religious freedom. So why on earth isn't the federal government allowing the courts to rule on this law? The notwithstanding clause, that is why. The notwithstanding clause shields the law from challenges of unconstitutionality. Essentially, it is a manual override to be used in case of emergency, when the need to pass a law quickly trumps the need to first scrutinize it and make sure it is constitutional. Like the War Measures Act, its use is meant to be only very occasional, invoked with extreme caution, and as a last resort. Because it is meant to be a temporary measure, the notwithstanding clause offers this protection for 5 years only. The shield must be reinstated every 5 years for the protection to continue. Thus, the notwithstanding clause was seen as a workaround for exceptional cases. Surely, no one would invoke it preemptively, repetitively, or abusively. Well, one need only look at Quebec's use of the notwithstanding clause to see all the fault lines. Not only has Quebec invoked the clause more than once, it has done so preemptively, indicating full knowledge of the unconstitutionality of certain laws at the time of their passing. Like crossing their fingers behind their backs while making vows, Quebec has used the clause without the sober restraint required. The Quebec government is drunk on its power, and the Canadian government, like the family member who lends money to the gambler, is enabling these abuses of the Constitution to occur. It is the existence of the notwithstanding clause that allows for the immoral, discriminatory Bill 21 to be upheld by preventing its being challenged. Nonetheless, private Quebec citizens have attempted the impossible, fighting the government in court. Following complications regarding public school teachers who wore headscarves being asked to choose between their employment and their faith, the English Montreal School Board in Quebec tried to challenge this law in court. Initially, they were victorious, and the law was deemed unconstitutional and inapplicable in the English school boards. Unfortunately, the Quebec government appealed the challenge and won because their use of the notwithstanding clause was deemed to be lawful, and therefore the law could not be challenged. It is noteworthy that the Quebec government used taxpayer dollars to appeal the challenge. Another teacher association, the Fédération Autonome de l'Enseignement, are about to start their own challenge to Bill 21. Will they be more successful and reverse the precedent to uphold Bill 21? It's unlikely, given the renewal of the notwithstanding clause. Canadians across the country should be appalled that in Quebec, one cannot wear a turban, kippa, cross, or headscarf while teaching in a public school. What kind of a message does this send about our country to our youth, to the international community? In fact, it is so obviously discriminatory that even Prime Minister Trudeau says he will support future challenges to Bill 21. Why is the federal government waiting for Canadian citizens to organize and pay for legal action that it will support instead of going after Bill 21 directly? Now is the time to act. The notwithstanding clause associated to Bill 21 has just been renewed last week. Will the federal government handle once and for all the difficulties inherent in the notwithstanding clause? Will the federal government show true leadership and protect minority rights, even if it angers Quebec politicians? Or will they wring their hands in despair as they have done to date? Will they themselves threaten to make use of the notwithstanding clause, as the leader of the opposition has done recently? I guess if you can't beat them, join them. The precedent is set. You don't think your law will pass muster? No problem. Invoke the notwithstanding clause. You think your law will be challenged in court? No problem. Invoke the notwithstanding clause. Getting pushback from concerned citizens, unions, associations, lobby groups? No problem. Invoke the notwithstanding clause. Where once the fear of appearing lackadaisical or lazy about respecting the Constitution is what prevented the use of the notwithstanding clause, today, thanks in large part to Quebec, who make chronic, repetitive, and preemptive use of the clause, the bad precedent is set. Any province desiring to bypass federal constitutional laws can now run roughshod over and over again without consequence by simply invoking the notwithstanding clause. I ask the federal government, what on earth are you waiting for? Which fundamental rights are going to be considered serious enough to garner swift action? What will it take for the federal government to act on behalf of its citizens in Quebec and elsewhere? We suggest disallowance. Disallowance is a sort of manual override on the manual override, like the two-step security feature on your access to online banking. The federal government can use disallowance to nullify the irresponsible use of the notwithstanding clause. Yes, little-known fact. Disallowance, provided it is used within 1 year of the renewal of the clause, is a tool the federal government can use to effectively throw in the trash bin any laws that are deemed unconstitutional by opening them up to scrutiny. Open the door to legal challenges. Disallow the renewal of the notwithstanding clause on Bill 21. Because of the recent renewal of the notwithstanding clause, the 1-year disallowance clock has just been reset. The federal government can and should act now before the notwithstanding clause protects Bill 21 for another 5 years. The CAPQ urges the federal government, don't wait for appeals to higher courts. Show support now. Don't wait to show support for legal action brought against Bill 21 by the Canadian citizens. Show support now. Show leadership now. Disallow the renewal of the notwithstanding clause now. What on earth is the federal government waiting for? Thank you. I now present the leader of the Canadian Party of Quebec, Mr. Colin Standish.
Thank you, Myrtis. And to my immediate left is Myrtis Fossey. Next on is William Tulin, a former Pontiac candidate. To my right is Keith Henderson, a member of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Party of Quebec. The Canadian Party of Quebec was founded in June 2022 as a principled federalist voice for the future of Quebec to unite all Quebecers in common cause, whether Anglophone, Francophone, Indigenous, or newcomer. What will we tell our children and grandchildren we did when Bill 21 was invoked? What will the public apology and eventual settlement sound like when the future Prime Minister of Canada apologizes for inaction for discriminatory legislation like Bills 21 and 96? From June 16th, when the Loi permettant au Parlement de Québec préserver les principes de la souveraineté parlementaire légale de la loi sur la laïcité de l'État comes into force, renewing Section 33, the override clause, the Government of Canada and all political parties, members and senators in the Parliament of Canada will have to make a choice. Contribute to the delegitimization of human rights in Canada and Quebec, or choose to become leaders of a country united in respect for the individual in a cohesive society with a singular Canadian citizenship. Parliamentarians of all stripes have the choice once again to strike down the use of the notwithstanding clause through the use of disallowance for the renewal of Bill 21. The recent decision by Quebec's Court of Appeal upheld the notwithstanding clause, as judicial review is limited to form, not the substance of the law. There's been an extension of the notwithstanding clause beyond the perimeters of sections 2 and 7 through 15, where minority language education rights and gender rights, once thought to be sacrosanct and outside the ambit of the notwithstanding clause, were not upheld. The delegitimising of the Canadian Constitution continues unabated in Quebec. We didn't sign the Constitution as a constant refrain from Quebecers of nearly all political stripes. I didn't understand personally how the Canadian Charter and the 1982 Constitution applied to Quebec without our consent until I attended law school. Of course, the 1982 constitutional amendments are valid legally and constitutionally with the Quebec's legislative approval. This was ruled upon twice by the Supreme Court of Canada, with Quebec making numerous arguments about the special status and a veto that were quashed by the court. In regards to constitutional amendments, at least with the Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accords, there were legitimate constitutional proposals, approved by provincial and federal legislatures, and in the latter case put to a vote in a national referendum. There was debate, democratic institutions were used legitimately, and Canadians had a societal debate about the nature of our country. The Canadian Constitution is being amended willy-nilly by provincial legislation under the false aegis of provincial constitutions as mentioned in Section 45 of the Constitution Act of 1982. Provincial constitutions do exist, little talked about until Bill 96's amendment, and are a mix of local laws, which can be considered quasi-constitutional at times, unwritten rules from the UK, and the date of reception of British common law and their jurisdictions under the 1867 Constitution. A province can unilaterally amend aspects of its internal constitution falling within the framework of the Canadian Constitution. However, until 2021, formal amendments to the written constitution outside the formal amending procedures were thought unthinkable. Quebec's own school boards were secularized in the literal sense, not the Bill 21 sense, by removing religious oversight, administration, and most religious teaching from public schools, not the prejudicial Charter of Values, Bill 60, Bill 21 sense of focusing on vestigial dress codes. In 1998, and made language specific with a formal constitutional amendment made by a separatist PQ government in Quebec City and the federal government. The Parliament of Canada and the Legislature of Quebec voted through resolutions using the bilateral amending formula of the 1982 Constitution. I still remember the day as an 11-year-old when we are no longer required to say grace before lunch at my elementary school. However, soft law amendments to the Constitution, procedure and rules have radically changed the selection of Supreme Court justices from Quebec and Senate appointments, alongside hard amendments in the written Constitution passed twice by Quebec and the Saskatchewan governments. One of the constitutional amendments reads as such. In Quebec's Oath Act, the Constitution Act 1867 is amended by inserting the following section after Section 128. Section 128 Q1, Section 128 does not apply to Quebec. In regards to the Distinct Society Clause that the Meech Lake proposed in its Section 2 of the, to be amended to the 1867 Constitution, it would act as an interpretive clause for the entire Constitution as a whole. The Charlottetown Accord included the rebranded and somewhat Orwellian Canada Clause, which included Quebec's distinct society. These clauses were thought to be so incendiary that significant public sentiment for and against were a key undercurrent in both debates. Too much for many and not enough for some, in part contributing to the odd outcome of the Charlottetown Accord vote that Ontario approved it and Quebec voted against it. This is all mesicized in Bill 96's controversial unilateral constitutional amendment. The amendment proclaims Quebec nation in two distinct ways that is rarely noticed. Quebecers form a nation, a sub-provincial, sub-national, ethno-linguistic group recognized in our Constitution. Hitherto unknown conception of recognizing a people as a nation in our constitutional framework. And a Quebec nation. Quebec is recognized as a province with a defined territory, defined jurisdictions, and a legal status in the 1867 Constitution, with a binary power within a binary power structure, the federal government and the provincial governments. A nation is not contemplated in any of our constitutional documents until now. As it reads in Bill 96, the Constitution Act 1867 is amended by inserting the fundamental characteristics of Quebec. Quebecers form a nation. French shall be the only official language of Quebec. It is also the common language of the Quebec nation. In regards to the Supreme Court justices in the Supreme Court here in Ottawa, the appointment of Supreme Court justices, a prerogative of the Prime Minister and Governor General and Cabinet, would be drawn from a selection of names provided by provincial governments under the Meech Lake Accord. All intergovernmental agreement, the arrangement concerning the appointment process to fill the seat that we left vacant in the Supreme Court of Canada following the departure of Justice Clément Gascon was endorsed on May 15, 2019 by the governments of Canada and the government of Quebec. That Prime Minister must consider a shortlist from the Quebec Justice Minister and the Premier of Quebec before selecting a Supreme Court Justice from Quebec. Yes, François Legault helped choose Nicolas Casserer. The SCC and the federal government that chooses them represents all Canadians, including Quebecers. And the province of Quebec should not be choosing or recommending 1/3 of Supreme Court judges which interpret the law for all Canadians at all levels of private and public life. An undertaking by the Prime Minister to appoint someone from a provincial shortlist or to appoint a single name provided by a province or a de facto practice where appointments are made in such a fashion is subversive of the Constitution and of the public interest. Additionally, the Supreme Court justices from the rest of Canada, Independent Advisory Board for the SCC judicial appointments, explicitly seeks only bilingual justices as has limited selection to certain provinces, both aspects that were once informal constitutional conventions. The recent turmoil stems from a dangerous pandering to Quebec nationalism and specificity in the worst possible way. Quebec would have rights that no other province and region has. Additionally, the French language is presented as the sole defining characteristic of Quebecers. For the reasons above, this has largely been achieved, a de facto and increasingly de jure legal sovereignty association with the rest of Canada. In conclusion, this toxic cocktail, shaken and stirred, is our current constitutional crisis. The question of the dissolution of Canada, or whether Quebec can be a separate society in Canada, is still being decided, this time in the shadows and in obscurity. Such is the current day, largely unspoken constitutional crisis. Our Constitution is no longer inviolable in Quebec. Quebec has a distinct legal status no other province has. Supreme Court justices from Quebec are shortlisted by Quebec for the Prime Minister. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms can largely be nullified through the notwithstanding clause. The Quebec and Canadian governments have worked in concert in these initiatives. What is to stop the Quebec government in the near or distant future from passing provincial legislation stating the Declaration of Union is, the Constitution Act 1867 is amended by inserting after Section 3, Section 3 does not apply to Quebec, thus dissolving Quebec's place as a province in Confederation. As it currently stands, politically and legally, nothing. And this appears to be the intent. Thank you.
Thank you. We will start the question period. If you have a question on Zoom, please use the raise hand option. This concludes the press conference. Thank you.
Thanks so much.